enigma. The Persian must be meant not on the land, but in wooden walls, upon the sea. Victory upon that element would mean the destruction of the huge army on land. The greater its numbers, the more helpless it would be in its position. It could not live upon the country. There must be a continual stream of seaborne supplies arriving from Asia, and this would be interrupted and cease altogether once the Greeks were masters of the sea. The Athens of the time was not the wonderful city that arose in later years, embellished by the masterpieces of some of the greatest architects and artists the world has ever known. The houses huddled round the foot of the citadel hill, the Acropolis, which was crowned with rudely built primitive temples. But the people whose home it was were startled by the proposal of Themistocles that their city should be abandoned to the enemy without one blow struck in its defense. Not Athens only, but every village and farm in the surrounding country was to be deserted. Men, women, and children, horses and cattle, were all to be conveyed across the narrow strait to the island of Salamis, which was to be the temporary refuge of the citizens of Athens and of the country folk of Attica. Would they ever return to their ruined homes and devastated lands, where they would find houses burned, and vines and olives cut down? Could they even hope to maintain themselves in Salamis? Would it not be better to fight in defense of their homes, even against desperate odds, and meet their fate at once, instead of only deferring the evil day? It was no easy task for the man of the moment to persuade his fellow countrymen to adopt his own far-sighted plans. Even when most of them had accepted his leadership and were obeying his orders, a handful of desperate men refused to go. They took refuge on the hill of the Acropolis, and, acting upon the literal meaning of the oracle, toiled with axe and hammer, building up wooden barriers before the gates of the old citadel. Everywhere else the city and the country around were soon deserted. The people streamed down to the ocean and were ferried over to Salamis, where huts of straw and branches rose up in wide extended camps to shelter the crowds that could find no place in the island villages. In every wood on either shore trees were being felled. In every creek shipwrights were busy night and day building new ships or refitting old. To every Greek seaport messages had been sent, begging them to send to the Straits of Salamis as many ships, oarsmen, and fighting men as they could muster. Slowly the Persian army moved southward through Thessaly. A handful of Spartans, under Leonidas, had been sent forward to delay the Persian advance, to hold the pass of Thermopylae between the eastern shoulder of Mount Etna and the sea. It was a hopeless position. To fight there at all with such an insignificant force was a mistake. But the government of Sparta, slaves to tradition, could not grasp the idea of the plans proposed by the great Athenian. They were half persuaded to recall Leonidas, but hesitated to act until it was too late. The Spartan chief and his few hundred warriors died at their post in self-sacrificing obedience to the letter of their orders. The Persians poured over the pass and inundated the plains of Attica. The few Athenians who had persisted in defending the Acropolis of Athens made only a brief resistance against overwhelming numbers. They were all put to the sword, and their fellow countrymen in the island of Salamis saw far off the pall of smoke that hung in the air over their city, where temples and houses alike were sacked and set on fire by the victors. The winds and waves had already been fighting for the Greeks. The Persian war fleet of 1,200 great ships had coasted southwards by the shores of Thessaly till they neared the group of islands off the northern point of Euboea. Their scouts reported a Greek fleet to be lying in the channel between the large island and the mainland. Night was coming on, and the Persians anchored in 8 long rows off Cape Sepias. As the sun rose there came one of those sudden gales from the eastward that are still the terror of small craft in the archipelago. The modern sailor would try to beat out to seaward, and get as far as possible from the dangerous shore. But these old world seamen dreaded the open sea. They tried to ride out the gale, but anchors dragged and hundreds of ships were piled in shattered masses on the shore. Some were stranded in positions where they could be repaired and refloated as the weather cleared up. But by the evening of the 3rd day, when at last the wind fell, only 800 galleys of the Persian armada were still in seaworthy fighting condition. Here, as on other occasions, the very numbers of the Persian fleet proved a source of danger to it. The harbors that could give shelter to this multitude of ships were very few and far between. Nor was it an easy matter to find that other refuge of the ancient navigator, a beach of easy slope and sufficiently wide extent to enable the ships to be dragged out of the water and placed high and dry beyond the reach of the angriest waves. The fact that the ships were beached and hauled up on the shore during bad weather and in winter limited their size, and in both the Persian and the Greek fleets there was probably not a ship much larger than the barges we see on our canals, or as big as some of the largest seagoing barges. The typical warship of the period of the Persian War was probably not more than 80 or 100 feet long, narrow and nearly flat-bottomed. At the bow and stern there was a strongly built deck. Between this poop and forecastle a lighter deck ran fore and aft, and under this were the stations of the rowers. The bow was strengthened with plates of iron or brass and beams of oak to enable it to be used as a ram, and the stem rose above the deck level and was carved into the head of some bird or beast. There was a light mast which could be rigged up when the wind served, and carried a cross yard and a square sail. Mast and yard were taken down before going into action. The Greeks called their war galleys triares, the Romans triremes, and the names are generally explained as meaning that the ships were propelled by three banks or rows of oars placed one above the other on either side. The widely accepted theory of how they worked is that the seats of the rowers were placed, not directly above each other, but that those who worked the lowest and shortest oars were close to the sides of the ship, the men for the middle range of oars a little above them and further inboard, and the upper tier of rowers still higher and near the center line of the ship. An endless amount of erudition and research has been expended on this question, but most of those who have dealt with it have been classical scholars possessing little or no practical acquaintance with seafaring conditions, and none of their proposed arrangements of the three banks of oars looks at all likely to be workable and effective. A practical test of the theory was made by Napoleon III when his History of Julius Caesar was being prepared. He had a trireme constructed and tried upon the Seine. There were three banks of oars, but though the fitting and arrangement was changed again and again under the joint advice of classical experts and practical seamen, no satisfactory method of working the superposed banks of oars could be devised. The probability is that no such method of working was ever generally employed, and that the belief in the existence of old world navies made up of ships with tier on tier of oars on either side is the outcome of a misunderstanding as to the meaning of a word. Trireme seems at first glance to mean triple oared, in the sense of the oars being triplicated. But there are strong arguments for the view that it was not the oars but the oarmen who were arranged in threes. If this view is correct, the ancient warship was a galley with a single row of long oars on either side, and three men pulling together with each heavy oar. We know that in old navies of the Papal States and the republics of Vienna and Genoa in the Middle Ages and the days of the Renaissance, and in the royal galleys of the old French monarchy, there were no ships with superimposed banks of oars, but there were galleys known as triremes, quadriremes, and pentaremes, driven by long oars each worked by 3, 4, or 5 rowers. It is at least very likely that this was the method adopted in the warships of still earlier times. A trireme of the early days of the Persian War with 50 or 60 oars would thus have a crew of 150 or 180 rowers. Add to this some 50 or 60 fighting men, and we have a total crew of over 200. In the Persian navies the rowers were mostly slaves, like the galley slaves of later times. They were chained to their oars and kept in order or roused to exertion by the whip of their taskmasters. To train them to work together effectively required a long apprenticeship, and in rough water their work was especially difficult. To miss the regular time of the stroke was dangerous, for the long oars projecting far inboard would knock down and injure the nearest rowers unless all swung accurately together. The flat-bottomed galleys rolled badly in a heavy sea, and in rough weather rowing was fatiguing and even perilous work. Some 200 men in a small ship meant crowded quarters, and lack of room everywhere except on the fighting deck. But as the fleets hugged the shore and generally lay up for the night, the crews could mostly land to cook, eat, and sleep. In the Persian ships belonging to many nations, and some of them to the Greek citizens of Asia, Xerxes took the precaution of having at least 30 picked Persian warriors in each crew. Their presence was intended to secure the fidelity of the rest.